Why are we so confused about lipedema, what it is, how to treat it? Well, if you're just now hearing about it, you're not alone. I hadn't heard about it a year ago. I just heard about it several months ago. Most physicians, if you read anywhere, most physicians don't know what lipedema actually is. So if you can't know what it is, you can't diagnose it. Let me just say that for any female that goes to a physician and she is very upset and feels like the physician should know, they do not know everything. Hopefully they read a lot outside of everything that they learned in medical school and all of the clinical practice and all of that. But I'm not saying that it's an excuse, and hopefully they will hear about it now. But don't be surprised if you go to a physician and they have this old school mentality of, well, it's just obesity, maybe you should lose some weight. And I don't think anyone here is arguing and saying that you shouldn't also do that. But what I'm saying is, if they've never heard of it, it's really difficult to diagnose. But you can help. You can send them to, Dr. Karen Herbst. Send them to some of her videos and have a conversation with them about it. Help them help you, I guess is what I'm getting at. I would also say too that diagnosis is mostly clinical, and Dr. Karen Herbst actually has a very interesting video on this where you can see her going through like the palpation and the clinical history of a female there in the video. And so it might be worth it to look it up and see. Even if you don't get a diagnosis, I think a lot of women want a diagnosis because they're contemplating surgery. But personally, I don't need someone to write it down in my file that I have lipedema. Why? Because, treatment is so vast. Most physicians, number one, if they've never heard of it, they can't diagnose it. Are they going to be able to treat it? They might look at it from different perspectives and go, well, I don't know. Is there pain? They might prescribe something. A lot of things come to mind for pain or, and the like, but just know that the diagnosis is mostly clinical. I don't know of any tests at this point that help assist with that. And go look for videos with Dr. Karen Herbst, and she'll really help you really get to an understanding, and you can delineate between all of that and see if it's worth the follow-up. I would also say that there aren't a lot of trustworthy resources that are available. I'm not saying that I'm the only one that goes down the rabbit hole. There are lots of people. There are lots of people that are willing to sit down and do the research and are willing to look at it from all angles, but that's not everyone. And so be able to distinguish between the two. Lipedema is very complex and it's often misunderstood, which presents a lot of challenges. The treatment is a challenge. What works for you might not work for someone else and vice versa. I can tell you when I was first learning about it and I was first watching every presentation that I could, with going deep down into the rabbit hole of how this actually happens, it really twisted my brain. And I thought, wow, I have a lot of education and this is still really complex. So I can only imagine someone who is thinking about this for the first time, how they might be feeling. So I understand. That's what I want to say about it. But don't give up. Don't give up. I must have put this last note here for a reason, because I guess I wanted you to know that your body manages water, salt, electrolytes, carbohydrates in a way that can be reflected in lipedema. Your adipose cells can store water. Other cells also store water, but we already talked about how the adipose cell can do that to kind of maintain its size and what have you. But just know that that is a part of what lipedema actually is. It might not be a major player for you like it is for me and like for a couple of other people that I've read about, but look into it and definitely see. Because can't you feel it in your clothes? if you've gained, a couple of pounds, they always try to make us believe that, oh well, if you lose weight, a lot of it's body water. Ladies, yes or no? Can you feel it or not? If you gain weight and it's water weight or not? Can you, yes or no, feel it in your body and in your clothes? Yes, of course we can. So it's always comical to me when they say, oh, well, it's just water weight. Well, it's probably water that you didn't need. But always make sure that you hydrate and you're taking in electrolytes if you need them. I also put some studies here for non-surgical treatments and for lipedema treatments, and I will list them in the description below. But I found this one study in a Reddit forum, and I thought it was really interesting. It wasn't published in a journal that I know of. It didn't seem to be peer-reviewed. It had a lot of authors. I looked the author up, and part of the focus and fascination with them is inflammation and lipedema, and so I find it really fascinating. And I actually began to incorporate, some of the things that they recommended here with the L-arginine and the N-acetylcysteine, which is NAC, and I felt like it really did a lot to really help advance the ball and sort of reduce a little bit of the lipedema. I will talk a little bit later about some things that I felt like really moved the needle for me, but some of those studies are really worth looking into, and so I encourage you to do exactly that. Just this one last tidbit in our rabbit hole. I find this study to be really interesting. I heard about it when I was listening to Dave Asprey, and he was talking to a guest about epigenetic memory of obesity after weight loss. And so I thought, I have to go look it up and I have to include it because it could have some correlations and findings that might be critical to the way that we actually understand lipedema and why this condition is generated. Because those are the questions that I have always, is how did we get here? And then if we could sort of understand that, then how do we advance the ball? So in this study that I put down at the bottom here of my screen, was found at nature.com, and some of the key findings that were discussed here was there are some epigenetic changes that occur. We know that environment creates a lot of obesity. And just because you have the gene pool doesn't mean that those things have to get turned on. But if they do get turned on, like in the case of obesity, for example, obesity can induce these modifications in epigenetics and in these fat cells, which alter the gene activity that's related to this inflammation and the fat storage, which can even persist and be significant after losing a large amount of weight. And in these studies with mice, they noted that the mice that were obese previously regained weight more rapidly when re-exposed to a high-fat diet compared to those without prior obesity, suggesting that there might be cellular memory that favors to returning to an obese state. So this is something that we have to be mindful of if they continue on with this type of research in humans. This, on a side note, downregulation of metabolism due to muscle loss we know can promote favorable fat gain. So epigenetics is just a whole other layer. And then when we're talking about upregulation of inflammation with these continued dieting efforts, then that can further compound the problem of everything else that we've already discussed in this same presentation regarding to fat loss and lipedema. So what are the implications here? Well, the analysis of the fat tissue from the individuals who underwent bariatric surgery showed that despite weight loss, their fat cells retained these obesity-induced epigenetic marks. And I find it fascinating and kind of like a oh crap moment at the same time. But it might also explain the common phenomenon of this weight regain after the dieting that's called the yo-yo effect, where your body gets really good. That's why I said earlier, your body gets really good at storing the fat. Because if you're losing a lot of muscle mass, and if we've got epigenetics at play, then those are both very favorable conditions for weight regain. Rapid fat loss that gives way to the muscle loss is really what I'm referring to. But I would also say that with this epigenetic memory that they've been investigating, we've heard something similar before called the set point theory. And that was kind of the theory that, your body has a set point of weight that it wants to go back to. And, a lot of us have actually wondered, maybe we were there at that set point and we couldn't further diet down to reach, or encourage more fat loss from the body, that we had done everything that the body wanted to do. I don't know if that is actually the case. It is a theory, so anything could be proven or disproven depending on how you want to look at it. But I did think that it was worth including this epigenetic memory study. So what are the implications here for lipedema? Well, if we think about the adipose fat cell, I wonder, just thinking out loud, if lipedema fat could also retain an epigenetic memory. If obesity could alter the fat cell gene expression, lipedema fat could also undergo similar changes. Maybe even more pronounced, we don't know. Because we know that lipedema is associated with this, soup of chronic inflammation, impaired lymphatic function, fibrotic fat. So it's possible that these fat cells also remember their previous states. Now, I'm not in the camp where I would say that the body wants to live in pain, and clearly that's not the case. But I just think that the implications could be, if we're looking at, epigenetic memory, it could, it wants to return to previous states. Does it want to be in an inflammatory state? No, I would think that not. Like, that wouldn't even be good for evolution, because if you think about evolution and how the body is designed, it's not a benefit to me to weigh 250 pounds, because if I'm trying to hunt, I'm going to get tired really easily. If I need to run from something, I'm also going to get tired very easily. So the body wouldn't want to be at that state of living. But just looking at this as an overview, this could explain why lipedema fat is resistant to diet and exercise, even more so than just your typical stubborn fat that you would find like in the hips and the thighs of women that don't actually have lipedema. I do think that it's worth pondering that there is an increased risk of regaining fat in lipedema affected areas. The study on the fat cell memory suggests that these previously obese fat cells regain weight even faster than normal ones. So if we're looking at my previous pictures where we could clearly see that lipedema was present and then it got worse, is that epigenetic memory at play? Is that just a situation that just got worse with time, the fat becoming even more fibrotic, leading to even more pain, more inflammation? It's already resistant to weight loss, so if it is retaining a memory of that prior weight, then maybe it could even explain why even after fat reduction that some of those areas tend to fill back up first. We've seen that in bariatric patients. If you looked at any of the stories, any of the Biggest Loser contestants, there was one that I remember that began to regain the fat after her bariatric surgery. And if you look at the fat redistribution, it's in the lower body, it's in the lower half of the body. So it just kind of is worth pondering and worth further investigation, and could reinforce why so many women with lipedema struggle with this fat redistribution after weight loss and the propensity to regain the weight. And then this last piece of, why these treatments should address, this epigenetics and inflammation. If it's epigenetic, meaning that we're turning these things on by environment. If you read any of the information on genetics, that just because, we can turn genes on and off. And so reducing chronic inflammation would be a key, and going beyond just regular weight loss, regulating fat metabolism with, some metabolic peptides, enhancing these, the lymphatic function of the body and giving that a boost, through red light therapy, compression, doing some movement, vibration plate, and then considering any potential future interventions that we could think about and investigate that could reset fat cell memory, looking into epigenetics, or, as to how are we turning these genes on and off that are, we're causing the programming to take place, and then looking at, can we reprogram like in these environments? That kind of stuff would be really fascinating to me. Also, surgical, implications for why lipedema fat could return. I've read that a lot of people do liposuction. I've heard that, some physicians say this is not the fat that you can just take out with liposuction because it's deeper than that. I don't know what the truth is on that. I've heard that some women report having great success with it. I've heard other women that don't have great success with it. I've heard other women report that they have fat regrowth in the same areas. So it just kind of makes me wonder if there's epigenetic memory. Then is this why, like in some, the lipedema fat could return post-surgery, where they're able to turn those genes off and just completely mitigate the memory? I don't know, but it's worth looking into. So if we're looking at post-lipo maintenance strategies, we have to consider everything that's anti-inflammatory, everything that's metabolic, just for regulation purposes, and to do everything that we can to prevent the recurrence of lipedema fat. So it could be that we consider peptides or metabolic modulators to help, reset lipedema fat. Maybe they could work. And I will talk about a little bit of the things that I did. Maybe they could work. But since the epigenetic marks are completely reversible, so it begs, an important question, that we sort of already posed here. Can these interventions help erase fat cell memory, or can we reset the fat cell memory? And how do we do that? Can peptides like MOTC play a role in restoring mitochondrial function and metabolic function in a healthy way? And what about tirzepatide? Can it override some of the hormonal resistance that we find in the condition that is lipedema? Or something even like thymus alpha 1 that can reduce chronic immune activation. I told you we were going down the rabbit hole. And this next part is, where we will really talk about some of the things that I really looked at for things that I wanted to try. And thymus alpha 1 is one of those, because I learned so much about it, and just the inflammatory state of just the body from being overweight and the lipedema and managing the inflammation. That was what this whole section was about. It's worth looking into it and doing everything that we can and finding all of the factors that we can mitigate to control those pieces of lipedema. Now in this section, I'm going to talk about lipedema and my hypothesis as to why I actually developed it. Here I've included a picture. I think it was about 14 here, when my parents took my sister and I and my mom to the Keys, and you could tell even here, even as a young girl, as an adolescent, you could look at my thighs, even below my skirt, and you can tell that the lower half of my body is proportionately larger. Clearly I'm overweight, but it's proportionately larger I would say disproportionately larger than my upper body is what I was trying to say. And not criticizing, but just from an observatory state, we just observe, and that's what we're going to do here. But this is my hypothesis. I believe that being overweight as a young girl, as an adolescent, as 11 years, 12 years old, contributed a lot to developing lipedema. I began dieting about the age of 12. So I effectively began to train my body to store fat via chronic dieting methods, withholding food for 5 to 7 days, perpetual weight loss, regaining, losing more muscle mass every time, being predisposed to weight regain every time I got discouraged. We talked about that a little bit already. Water fasting for several days at a time. Everybody always talks about how water fasting is so beneficial for women. I don't feel like that's the case. At least it hasn't been for me. I feel like it contributed to the problem because of the stress signaling that goes out when you're that's an extreme caloric deficit when you're water fasting. Think about it. More of my hypothesis. Years of birth control pills, greater estrogen influx, decreases testosterone over time, and even when you stop taking it, your testosterone may never go back to normal levels, which also predisposes to more fat regain. Consistently eating things I shouldn't have eaten, high fructose corn syrup, a lot of it I didn't know way back in the day, but poor dieting habits. I loved sugar, and keeping myself in that high insulin state, high glucose state only added, to the inflammation that would become chronic inflammation later. Decreased insulin sensitivity over time. Over fatness. So some level of insulin resistance was developing over time, although I never reached the point of having high glucose. If you listen to Dr. Ben Bikman, he will tell you that that's not all of the clinical picture that exists. We have to start looking at insulin levels. We have to get tests for that. Just measuring glucose levels does not paint the entire picture. My glucose levels were always, quote, normal, yet I was overweight, and if I had not done something sooner, I would be type 2 diabetic by now. I'm almost sure of it. But the continued fat gain and times when I gave up, the yo-yo dieting, the extreme caloric deficits, the lack of consistent weight training. I say consistent because I had lots of times where I went really hard on weight training, and that helped me a lot. But extreme caloric deficits, I felt like none of the weight training really does enough to mitigate an extreme caloric deficit. At least that's what I've seen for myself, no matter how much protein I consumed in resistance training, especially in these years. But I would also, for my last point here, the spiritual aspect. I was desperate. I felt desperate about my body. I felt desperate to lose weight. Lack of compassion for self, lack of compassion for just my body in general, lack of understanding that my cells were doing everything that it could to mitigate the inflammation, the pain, the switches that were being turned on, the epigenetics that were probably being, all switches were, turned on because of the food environment. The disdain that I had for my thighs. Yes, I had a lot of disdain for my thighs. My lack of self-belief. I went through times where I really believed that I could lose weight, and then I did. But there were times when I would feel like it was really impossible. This was just an impossible task. And then I would find my way again, get back on the research train, and because I never give up. But I would say that the spiritual aspect of all of this is really critical into shaping the weight loss journey, and specifically a journey for lipedema. We have to figure out how to have more compassion for self and get rid of the disdain, get rid of the self-doubt, get rid of the disbelief, and move into this place of, I'm going to do everything I can, I'm just going to keep digging. Because that's really the point that I want to get you to today, is just going, just going to keep going, just going to keep digging. I'll never give up. Never, ever give up.